Okay, buckle up, everybody. Long chapter. Chapter 22 of The Ultimate Evil by Maury. A Call to Copco. It had been 6 years and 40 miles of bad road, but from Gravetson Bay in Brooklyn to the old aqueduct in Yonkers, the story was the same. Evidence demonstrated a conspiracy had been uncovered in every crime first attributed to David Berkowitz alone. Now, even the basic police belief that all the 44 shootings were random acts of violence was challenged by the informants. But was there any truth to these allegations? Pretty, dark-haired Donna Loria was the first Son of Sam victim. She was slain deliberately, the informant said. Berkowitz was very weird and vague about this one, which he admits he did, Vinny reported. But he said she knew something about the group, or about someone in it, and started talking. She was killed because she talked too much. He wasn't specific, but her killing had special significance. The part made sense. All of the victims, only Donna was named in the Breslin letter, crowned a very, very sweet girl. In the cynical taunting in the cynical taunting prowls that spewed from the printer's pen. But what about the rest of the story? Could it be supported? It could. Donna, a medical technician, and Jody Valente, a student nurse, were attacked on a weekday. With the exception of the Chain slaying, the 44 assaults happened on weekends. So why was Donna shot at 1:10 a.m. on a Thursday? They always went to the Peachtree Disco on Wednesday nights, Donna's father, Mike Loria, had told me. The glitzy Peachtree was in New Rochelle, a city with multiple links to the 44 case. Habitual Wednesday visits there could well have explained the timing of a deliberate attack. Moreover, it was established that members of the Carr family, at least occasionally, patronized the Peachtree. A reporter earlier suspicious a reported earlier a suspicious yellow car was seen cruising Donna's block shortly before she went out that last night. And later, just minutes before the shooting, Mike Loria spied a yellow Nova-sized car occupied by a lone male parked across the street and behind Jody's car. Additionally, the police themselves originally believed that the shots were aimed only at Donna. Perhaps one of the most pertinent pieces of the Donna Loria puzzle was hidden in a long-forgotten, confidential police report. In it, a male acquaintance of Donna's was quoted by a young woman Donna knew. According to the woman, the man said shortly before Donna's death, Donna had 1 week to live. Although the informants were second-hand, its import cannot be downplayed. Within 10 days of the statement, Donna was indeed dead. The NYPD didn't disregard it either. This youth was a prime suspect until he provided an alibi, and Jody Violante said he wasn't the gunman. Of course the alibi was valid. Berkowitz committed the crime. But he did this man who had a checkered past but did this man who had a checkered past know something was coming? I also recalled the Lorias sadly telling me that Jody Violante, whom they regarded almost like a daughter, seemed to avoid them in the months after the murder. We could never understand that, Mike Loria explained. Perhaps Jody experienced unsettling reminders of the tragedy when she saw Donna's parents, but maybe as one of Donna's closest friends, she herself had heard something and tried to suppress her suspicions. I don't have that answer yet, but what is certain is that 9 months after Donna's slaying, Valentina Suriani and Alex Esau were gunned down in a car parked barely 100 yards from Jody's front door. Another coincidence? Only the killers know for certain. But the initial question was, did information exist to fortify the jailhouse charges that Donna was an intentional victim? The answer, yes. Target crimes, Vinny labeled them, saying that the cult, to cloud issues and disguise motives, would commit random shootings to hide the fact that some victims were purposely marked for death. Like Donna Loria, the beautiful 26-year-old Christine Freund was said to have been slain in such a target crime. In 1984, the now retired NYPD veteran Hank Sinodi and I sought out Christine's boyfriend for 7 years, John Deal. Christian and Deal were seated in the car in Forest Hills, Queens, on January 30th, 1977, when the fatal shots were fired at about 12:30 a.m. Fortunately, Deal wasn't hit. Christine was by far the oldest son of Sam victim, and we wanted to determine if more than a coincidence was at play in that regard. We also had other allegations to work with, courtesy of Vinny. Now 36, a short, athletic, curly-haired Deal was a bartender by trade. When we found him, he was serving customers in a friendly Queens grill. Ironically, Christine Freund's younger sister, Eva, dropped by while we were talking with Deal. Her presence may have been an omen, because the case began to unravel that evening when I posed a question to Deal said no one had asked before. Did anything unusual happen earlier that night? I wanted to know. That opened the floodgates. The police hadn't covered the entire evening. Now, through Deal's statement and supporting official documents, the true story of Christine Freund's final hours emerged. It was an eerie tale, one of which stirred images of the chilling Arliss Perry operation. The story began 2 nights before the murder, when Chris received 2 calls from an anonymous man who asked, "Are you Christine Freund? Do you live on Linden Street?" Frightened, Chris told the caller she was married to a cop, hung up the phone and phoned Deal. This information also appeared in confidential police reports. The next evening, Chris remained late in Manhattan socializing with her girlfriends. On Saturday night, with the temperature locked at a frigid 14 degrees, Deal picked up Chris at her house home in the Ridgewood section of Queens at about 8 o'clock on Metropolitan Avenue, as they were en route to Forest Hills to see the film Rocky. A yellowish-colored car pulled abreast of Deal on the passenger side. The driver, whom Deal couldn't describe, peered at them before speeding off. Deal didn't know if another person was in the car. It was an unusual thing, Deal recalled. He passed us on the wrong side on a street that was icy and narrow. There was snow piled at the curbs. After slowing down to look at us, he drove off at maybe 40 miles an hour. The conditions weren't good for that, but I can't remember what model or size the car was. A few minutes later, Dale and Chris arrived in front of the Forest Hills Theater on Continental Avenue, 71st Street. The motive was going to be crowded, and the narrow street was swarming with people and cars. I was stopped in the middle of the street, Deal explained. It was cold, and I knew I'd have trouble parking, so I told her to go inside and get the tickets, and I'd meet her there. So Chris got out there in the middle of the block. Deal then circled the neighborhood unsuccessfully. There were no parking spaces to be found. He next drove east on Austin Street, turned south at the first intersection, and traveled west on Burns, heading back toward Continental and Station Plaza, less than 2 blocks south of the theater. There, in Station Plaza, Deal noticed a parking spot some 3 car lengths in front of the corner of Continental and parallel parked, backing into the space. His car was facing Continental. As he turned off the engine, the pale yellow light tan or off-white compact size of a Chevy Nova or Ford Fairlane suddenly stopped at about 30 feet behind him in the middle of the street. The car, which was between 5 and 8 years old, was occupied by two men and was unnaturally angled so that its headlights shone on Deal's blue Firebird. As Deal idly watched, the passengers in the compactor jumped out and leaned against its open door while gazing intently at the Firebird. The man appeared to be thin and had dirty blonde or sandy-colored hair that was styled in a blow-dry cut. He looked to be in his 20s, and his face seemed pinched, said Deal, whose version was somewhat restricted by the headlight's glare. Deal, now out of his car, locked the Firebird and being late, began to jog north to the theater. The other man then climbed back into the compact, which drove away. 4 hours later, the murder would occur in this exact spot. After the movie, at about 11 p.m., Deal and Chris walked about a quarter-mile through the biting cold to the Wine Gallery restaurant on Austin Street, where they lingered until about 12:20 a.m. While there, Chris remarked that two men seated behind Deal and near the door while staring at her and making her uneasy. Deal turned around and stole a quick look at them. One, whom Chris termed creepy, had brown hair and severe acne scars. The other, Deal reported to police in 1977, had sandy blonde hair, parted in the center. He also wore a mustache and appeared to be in his early 30s. When the couple left the wine gallery, the two men were nowhere around, but someone else was lurking. Outside the restaurant, Deal bumped into a man he positively identifies as David Berkowitz. Berkowitz was dressed in a beige raincoat, the same garment he was seen wearing just 2 blocks away at the Boquerra chain killing 6 weeks later, and had one or both hands stuffed into his pockets. Sorry, Deal apologized to Berkowitz, who merely replied, Okay. Leaving David behind, Deal and Chris began the quarter-mile trek to the car. Now the streets were empty as the numbing cold gripped the night. Street signs rattled in the wind, and steam clouds rose skyward from the manhole covers that speckled the snow-lined Austin Street. Deal pulled Chris close to him as they walked. At the corner of Continental and Austin, they noticed a solitary young man with an orange knapsack who appeared to be hitchhiking in a curious direction. Right into the middle of exclusive Forest Hills Gardens, it was an unlikely route to be traveled at that hour, in that weather. Regardless, the man slowly made his way south, staying in the middle of Continental and Deal, and Chris passed him by. The couple then cut diagonally across Continental and hurled beneath the Long Island Railroad trestle on the corner of Burns. Their car was parked at about 50 feet in from the intersection. When they reached the Firebird, which faced Continental, Deal opened his door, climbed in, and leaned over to unlatch the passenger's door for Chris. Deal then started the engine, revved it, and put on an ABBA tape while the car warmed up. God, it's cold, Chris said, and Deal hugged her briefly and gave her a light kiss. We had been going out a long time. We weren't making out in the car, he explained. Accordingly, he said, it was impossible that anyone approached them from the front, but as he prepared to pull away, 3 shots were fired through the passenger's window, shattering the glass. Two of the slugs hit Chris, one in the head, and she died a few hours later. Across the street, a woman heard the gunfire and looked out from her room to see a red car speeding from the scene. Deal himself leaped from the Firebird and began shouting, "They shot her! They shot my girlfriend," witnesses reported. "Why," I asked Deal, "did you use the word they?" "I don't know," he replied. "It was just an expression." "Maybe so." Were the prison informants accurate? Was Christine Freund a deliberately targeted victim shot by Manson too, rather than Berkowitz? After visiting the scene with Deal and Snowdy and meticulously reenacting the events of that fatal night, I showed Berkowitz's confession to Deal. Like other key figures, Deal wasn't interviewed by authorities after the arrest. Reading the transcripts, Deal immediately labeled Berkowitz's version as totally false in critical areas. I bumped into him, all right," Deal said, pointing at the confession, "but it was way back in the wine gallery, not where he said, and he was facing the other way, away from the direction we were going, the eventual crime scene." But Berkowitz had indeed confessed to bumping into Deal. There was no argument there. So what was the problem? The problem was that Berkowitz, trying to get himself away from the restaurant and back to the crime scene, erased nearly a quarter mile by claiming he nearly touched shoulders with Deal as the couple diagonally crossed Continental Avenue near the railroad trestle, only about 125 feet from their car. "That's pure bullshit," key witness Deal told me, and he later repeated his entire statement to Tom Russo in DA John Santucci's office. Deal further explained that Berkowitz lied again when he confessed to being 4 or 5 feet away from the couple as they entered their car. Berkowitz later tried to enhance this claim when he told a psychiatrist that he was able to watch from such a close distance by hiding behind a tree. If so, he must have lugged a spruce tree from Yonkers because there wasn't any tree not there, Deal added. Nobody passed us up either. The only person we saw was the hitchhiker, and we passed him. Then how did Berkowitz pull the trigger, as he first claimed to have done? He was well behind the couple whose car was facing forward, and the gunman and Berkowitz confessed did approach from the rear. So if it was Berkowitz, he would have walked right by Deal, warmed up the car, turned around, and came back to fire. "He did not walk past us," Deal said. Berkowitz said he didn't either. He just left an unchallenged gaping hole in his confession, perhaps purposely. Nobody caught these major discrepancies in 1977 because no one analyzed the crime scenes, paid attention to the direction of the Firebird faced, or interviewed Deal after the arrest. Nobody wanted to. Together, these contradictions comprised what might be politely be termed significant flaws in the Freund confession. But then hadn't the prison informants, quoting Berkowitz, said he shot only the Bronx victims? And another important allegation was now supported. But what about the deliberate hit on Manson too? Simply stated, the entire series of events bolstered the charge that Christine Freund was purposely chosen for death. Berkowitz, in his confession, did make one claim, which seemed to be supported by the facts. When asked why only 3 shots were fired, he replied there was only one person to shoot, which was exactly the point the informants were making. Here is my analysis of the Freund murder. First, to ascertain they had the right girl and address, The killers anonymously phoned Chris twice to ask if she was Christine Freund on Linden Street. 2 nights later, her first evening out of Queens since the calls, Chris and Deal were passed by the yellow car in the unusual manner Deal described. This act suggested that they were followed from the Freund home, and the killers pulled ahead on the passenger side to visually identify Chris. Turning off a block or two up the road, they probably fell in behind again and tailed the couple to the letter. But there was the congregation of cars and people they missed seeing Chris as she left the Firebird in the center of the street. That wasn't surprising because the assassins were locked in on the car itself, which was still sitting in traffic. Believing Chris, she was still on the Firebird, they stayed with Deal as he searched for a parking spot. When Deal parked, they readied to do the hit there, and then the yellowish compact, a familiar sight at a 44 scene, pulled up and aimed its headlights at Deal's car, ready to strike. The shooter hopped out. Only three was no Christine. So they waited. The interim, a small red car specified by the prison informants, replaced the yellow one, a feat easily accomplished because multiple cars were an intrinsic part of the operation. In fact, the killers had time to drive back to Westchester if necessary. Leaving the theater, the young couple was shadowed by the wine gallery, where Christine eyed 2 conspirators, including Manson II, and called them to Deal's attention. The men then left the restaurant, leaving Berkowitz to monitor the young lovers. The accomplices returned to Station Plaza and waited in the red compact, which a witness observed there a few minutes before the attack. He told police the car's engine was running and that it was occupied by 2 people. Deal and Chris then left the wine gallery. After the bumping incident, Berkowitz followed them to the shooting site, saw them diagonally cross Continental Avenue, and watched the murder from behind a tree on the opposite northwest corner of Continental and Station Plaza. From that vantage point, which was in the front of Deal's car, Berkowitz fled his own auto, which was parked on a winding street, probably Tennis Place. While the killer escaped in a small red car, this auto, which was precisely described as to color and size by the prison informants, was observed racing from the block by a second witness. The car's presence was not revealed to the public. On the basis of all the circumstances and evidence, I believe the murder occurred in the manner just described. The hitchhiker may or may not have been involved with the killers. Since he never came forward, the question remains unresolved. As for the man in the wine gallery, Berkowitz's presence outside, his desire to distance himself from that location, strongly suggested they were part of the setup. Moreover, the acne-scarred man, who was soon tentatively identified as an associate of his, and the companion's description was very similar to the one Vinny provided for Manson II. He had an athletic build, was maybe 5'10", and had sandy blonde hair, which was straight or wavy rather than curly, Vinny said. I think he would have been about 30 in 1977. He would have been in his early 20s when he was allegedly involved with the original Manson. Yeah, that's right, and they brought him in to shoot Freund. Did he have a mustache? I don't know, I don't recall. But those things come and go easily, Vinny replied. The description was so similar, though not precisely so, that of the man who jumped from the compact. John Deal, however, couldn't say if the man and the one seated near the door in the wine gallery were the same person. Nothing about that compact meant anything to me until you asked me about the whole night, Deal explained, so I never gave that possibility a thought until now. It's been several years, so I just can't say if they were the same guys. Vinny's portrayal of Manson 2 also matched that of the man who was reportedly watching the Alifa shooting and drove off in a yellow car with its lights extinguished. Moreover, this description was similar to that of two men connected to the Arliss Perry case. The law firm visitor and the man who entered the Stanford church minutes before her death. There were numerous common denominators. There were numerous common denominators, but without eyewitness identification, we couldn't try to obtain unless we learned who Manson 2 was. No positive conclusion could be drawn. The question of motive remained the Freund killing. Berkowitz knew it was a hit. He was very clear on that, Vinny said, but he said he didn't know the motive. Someone else did, though Berkowitz only knew that someone had a connection to Camaro and RR, that the Camaro acted as the so-called random 44 shooting that were going on. Vinny provided the name of the person who supplied him with the motive and said it was someone who had knowledge of the drug porn phase of the operation. The motive, Vinny said, was as old as time itself. It involved her boyfriend and another woman, John Deal. He was about to become engaged to Christine, I countered. What the hell are you talking about? He was fooling around with another woman and toes were stepped on. That's the way I got it. Whose toes? And who had the damned connection? Was it the woman herself, or did she have another boyfriend who was pissed? Triangles are messy, Vinny answered. I know part of it was a warning to her boyfriend Deal, but Christine herself may have done something to set it off too. Shit, I can't interrogate people around here when I feel like it. I was told the answer was in that triangle, and that at least some of it was a warning to him. I don't know if the woman had it done, or a boyfriend. In fact, since the Freund killing occurred before the 44 caliber killer was born, the NYPD was searching for a motive in the shadowy recesses of John Deal's clandestine affair with a married Queenswoman who, with her husband, had temporarily relocated to Germany. The information was not made public. Deal was in love with Christine Freund, but he was occasionally tempted by after-hours opportunities. He told Sinodi and me that 3 such liaisons happened in the fall of 1976, a few months before the murder. The intent here is not merely to examine John Deal's private life. Rather, murder is a public crime. Christine Freund was dead, and serious allegations had surfaced concerning another woman in Deal's world. On the affairs, Deal acknowledged. He classified 2 as one-nighters, but the other was more serious. Christine learned of the deeper affair when she borrowed Deal's car, and a love letter from the married woman fell from the visor. Christine then took steps to disrupt the relationship, even though the woman was then in Germany for a time. After laying down the law to Deal, Chris mailed a note to the woman. Police found a draft copy of the woman's reply, threatening to expose the relationship to her husband unless she stayed away from John. According to police reports, the woman remained in love with Deal despite the letter. But on the surface, the matter appeared to be settled. However, the woman did have three possible motives for murder. First, to preserve her marriage, which she apparently wanted to do. Second, to hit Deal with a message that he should consider coming back to her. And third, to eliminate Chris because Chris intended to marry John Deal. The woman's husband also had a motive. He approached Deal one day and asked if he was having an affair with his wife. Deal denied it, but that didn't mean the husband believed him, nor did it mean that the woman couldn't have had still another boyfriend, someone else who wanted Deal to stay away from for his own reasons. After the murder, the NYPD spent several weeks interviewing Chris's friends, some of whom knew about the affair and her letter, but on March, 5 days later, Virginia Valcaricane was shot to death barely a block from the Freund scene. The shooting, which occurred at about 7:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, broke both the Wednesday and time of day patterns of the 44 attacks. The Valcaricane murder had a fascinating impact. Police immediately linked the two slayings and abandoned that lone, deranged madman was stalking the city. All investigations of motive in the Freund killing ceased on the spot. Was it possible the Valcaricane shooting occurred when and where it did to deliberately deter the police probe of the triangle motive in the Freund murder? It was distinctly possible. The entire picture could have explained Deal's enigmatic "they shot her" cry at the scene of Christine's killings, which he maintained was just an expression. Was he warned ahead of time? I asked Vinny later. I don't know if he was or not. I just don't know if the whole thing was sent to him. I don't know if the whole thing to send him a. I just don't know if the whole thing was to send a message to him or if some of it was to get back at her or both. And I don't know yet either, but I do have a suspicion. However, as Vinny said, someone had the means of contacting, directing, or indirectly either RR or Camaro, who allegedly then solicited the children. I think all involved did it as a favor to their connections, Vinny said. It was important enough to somebody that Manson 2 was brought in. Whatever the final outcome of the Freund case, John Deal is an innocent man, aware of the prison statements. He cooperated with the probe. Secretive dalliances with women doesn't place responsibility for Christine's death on his shoulders. Apparently, he didn't know what he was involved with, and Christine may have partly contributed to her own demise. The waters remain murky. I am also not accusing either Deal's lover or husband of complicity in murder. That has yet to be proven. To return to the original prison allegations, Vinny's report that Christine Freund's murder was sparked by a situation which concerned her boyfriend and another woman was strongly supported, as was the concurrent and complementary charge that the murder was a deliberate hit. On the basis of all available evidence, it was now possible to arrive at a full analysis of the 44 attacks. Victims: Donna Loria Violante Denaro, apparent shooter Berkowitz, quite possibly a woman, 3 potential suspects identified. Lomino Demasi, Freund Vaquerichain, John Carr, the chief suspect, Manson 2, quite possibly a woman, 3 potential suspects identified, Serrani Esau, Berkowitz, Placido Lupo, unknown but not to Berkowitz, Moskowitz Violante, the hospital worker, 2 possible suspects identified. Others said to have belonged to a cult or suspected of participating in Son of Sam shootings or related crimes were mentioned earlier. The roster wasn't complete. Some group members remained unidentified. In 1986, I asked Vinny to summarize, in his own words, the Westchester, New York City, Long Island relationships. Years after he first stepped forward, this was his written reply. When Berkowitz and I first met, I told him I thought his original demon story was bullshit. He afterwards showed me those Gannett articles and your letters to convince me his satanic story was credible, had some basis in fact. I questioned him about the Westchester group for specifics when they met, who was who, names, etc. He had told me all about the Carr brothers, etc., and now I was asking him about Mr. R.E., real estate, and the cult. I wanted to get info to find Mr. Real Estate and get that coven book of deeds done. He began to tell about Camaro and how the Mr. Real Estate really got orders from someone bigger. How some of the incidents, 44 attacks, were not random but contracted. Camaro was the go-between. Where was he from? Go-between from where and between who? That's when he told me about the place in the village and about Sissek Sisman. This intrigued me. How did he know that? Sounded like BS to me. He had been there, he said, along with Michael Carr. He saw the place, saw the chandelier, went to a party there. At least a party was going on. David waited in the foyer. They asked to pick something up, and that's how he began to tell me about Mr. Big. Mafia? That was my first thought. No, drugs and sex and entertainment. Kinky shit. Big lived on Long Island, a mansion. Had David been there? He hesitated, denied being there, eventually admitted he had been there. Berkowitz explained what he knew, or what he was willing to let up he knew, about Mr. Big. He said he didn't know the guy's name, just Mr. Big, Shades of Rocky, and Bullwinkle. I sent out feelers. It was, name withheld, who verified what David said about the Chelsea setup. Drugs? You bet your ass. Cars out front like it was Sunday, and this was a church service. Did the cops know? Hell, they directed the traffic so there'd be no hassle for the paying customers. Vinny was writing about events which preceded Ronald Sisman's killing. 2 years after that murder, a police department scandal erupted in the 10th precinct where Sisman lived. Several officers were being removed for alleged collusion with owners' after-hours clubs. Payoffs were involved. The NYPD ruled. Ironically, Berkowitz did let the name slip of R.R., Mr. Big. It was on my lists as both Roy Rogers and Rodman the Flying Monster, but it was among many names, and at first I couldn't tell who was who. R.R. was into drugs. He was into a lot, but as I understated it, it was drugs which was his real link to Sissek and Mr. Real Estate. I wonder how he became involved with Mr. Real Estate. I know Mr. Real Estate was prominent to some degree in Westchester law and political circles, and that to Chelsea Place was a hangout for political types from all over. I'm sure Mr. Real Estate organized the children on his own, and Sisic, R.R. Camaro were their suppliers. I believe Mr. Real Estate was intimately tied to R.R./Sisic, and his children were merely a mechanism for distribution in Westchester and environs. The group in Westchester had existed for some time. Berkowitz said that when he joined it, a small circle of a dozen members had long planned the events which later came about. It was planned long before Berkowitz entered the picture. Various dastardly deeds had been done all along, as Berkowitz also told Harris Lipsig, buildings upon the crescendos of violence which later ensued. R.R. never personally came to Westchester, as I understand it. Sisic didn't either. Camaro was the angel for them. The real reason for the shootings was the need of R.R. et al. The group had been itching for ultimate violence. Perhaps the first event, Donna Loria's murder, was even a natural, sick culmination of their hype. But most certainly Mr. Real Estate capitalized on his children's enthusiasm very quickly. It is almost incredible how R.R. then capitalized and organized the whole operation. It was actually very organized. In retrospect, it is obvious no lone nut could have carried it out as smoothly and methodically as it was. Movement, arms, procurement, strategy for locating victims, hours, etc. were all carefully planned out, as were escape routes. In Berkowitz's own words, Camaro came to some 44 scenes as an advisor, a coordinator of events, and he did not always come alone. Mansion 2 came and was an actual actor, shooter, a special guest weirdo, so to speak. We both knew how fantastic it really got, right down to the videotapes of the action. R.R. originated the original story Friday the 13th, Homebox channel right there in New York City. You know how much of a net there was. We still see evidence of it. To anybody as knowledgeable as we are of the workings and efficiency, the police machine, it is not incredible to see how all this went on undetected. I mean that Ford's Theater had been on Central Avenue when Lincoln was shot, and had the whole Westchester PD been present, and had they all seen Booth jump from the balcony, they probably would have arrested an old lady in the third row mezzanine as their suspect. R.R. needed some chores taken care of. He needed those chores done for other persons to whom he was indebted or for whom he did things. I believe drugs was the real link between R.R. and the children. The events were natural consequences of the relationship. It finally got out of hand. I got too hot, so they decided to put an end to it publicly, at least. But the paranoia did not stop. Mistrust led to the Sisic's demise. To summarize, R.R. was into a big kinky scene. He controlled money, people, and drugs, and he used all of them in a very calculated fashion. It boomeranged, that much I know. So what was R.R. called? So who was R.R.? Called both Roden and Roy Rogers, and linked in a coded sentence to Dale Evans? Roy Rogers and Dale Evans are my favorite stars. We were a regular jet set of the occult. In the 1981 letter reads, "Stars, jet set." Vinny seemed to be talking about high rollers and the entertainment business, perhaps about a lofty meshing of drug, kink, and cult activities and show business? Maybe so. In the spring of 1982, when Mike Zuckerman and I first met with Vinny, and at Dannemora. We asked him about Dale Evans and RR. Berkowitz wasn't talking at the time, so Vinny had to give it his best shot alone. I can't remember if the key word is Dale or Evans in that one. Whichever. Him and Roy Rogers are the biggies. Then what about Roy Rogers? Roden. Who the hell is he? Zuckerman asked. His first name is Roy, Vinny replied, and he lives in a big mansion in a town with two names on Long Island. Shit, I can't quite come up with the damn town, but it begins with an S. Sandpoint, Zuckerman tried. Vinny looked thoughtful. That may be it, but he's into all sorts of weird shit with whips and chains and kiki crap. What's the last name? I asked quietly. The visiting room wasn't crowded, and Zuckerman and I were dressed as downbeat as possible to resemble nothing more than street friends of Vinny. Still, we didn't want to call any attention to ourselves by appearing to interrogate him. Serious questions were asked with relaxed smiles. Damn, it's something like Roden or Rudin or Roden, Vinny said, pressing his thumb and forefinger to his forehead. He was under a strain, and it occasionally showed. I'm sorry, but I'm a little nervous here. But this guy beat the shit out of some actress and took videotapes of it. At the mansion, Berkowitz was at his place once, and in Minot too. So he did go to Minot, I muttered. He was throwing hints all over the place, and we had a girl ID him there. Yeah, Vinny nodded, but I thought you already knew that. He thought you did. You know a lot of stuff, but some shit escaped you. Huh. Sure it did. That's why we're here. But we know enough to see if you're bullshitting. Don't forget that. You don't have to play Mr. DA with me, Vinny said. Can't you just listen and tell those fucks back there in New York to shove it? They all screwed up in the first place, not me. You gotta worry more about their bullshit than mine. If I was gonna bullshit, I'd have talked to some reporter who didn't know anything. Not you, for Christ's sake. Vinny looked exasperated. What about this Long Island money man? Zuckerman cut in, blanching at a swallow of Dannemora vending machine coffee. Berkowitz was at his place once? Yeah, this guy had a lot of parties for all sorts of idiots, dopers, bikers, big shots. I don't even know if he knew Berkowitz's name. I meant there were a lot of people always at this jerk's place. So why was Berkowitz there? Because of the tie-ins with the cult and all. I don't know who he went with there. But it was for one of those big parties. And what about the Moskowitz tape, I asked. That was made for Roden Sissek Sisman, some guy Mickey, and whoever else, and Camaro was there that night too. Either Mickey or Sissek made that thing. I believe it was Mickey as I got it. Okay, but what was the big guy's name? It's Roy whatever, Roden. It sounds like that code name. Throughout the day, we kept returning to Roden, and Vinny couldn't remember the actual name. On the way back to the airport, Zuckerman and I were mouthing the possible names aloud. Suddenly, we both had it. Roy Raden. We simultaneously shouted, and it's Southampton, not Sands Point, I said. Goddamned Vinny not only couldn't remember the place, he thought it was 2 words. It begins with an S, he says. Shit, he's been inside too long, but it does sound like 2 words. Yeah, Zuckerman answered, and Berkowitz's last shoot 'em up in a disco was supposed to be in Southampton, too. That's right. Damn, talk about your chickens coming home to roost. I'll bet that was a deliberate clue. Rodin is right. Freaking Roy Radin. That actress thing happened out there a couple years ago, Zuckerman remembered. Maloney Haller, I think her name was. She was on Welcome Back to Nodder or something. She said they doped her up, stripped her, raped her, and videotaped it at some weekend orgy Radin was running. Yeah, now I remember. And they put her on a train to New York, all spaced out, and the cops were called by the train people. Whips, bondage, and videotape, Zuckerman smiled. You like that part about the taping, right? Hell yes. It's a fetish of Radin's, just like at Stacy's murder. I'll tell you, there are some things at that scene that the camera's presence could explain. I think that tape does exist, but finding it is another thing. Look, what Sisman appears to have gotten for his interest in it. You know, that thing could be for Radin's private collection, Zuckerman said, but if you ever wanted to sell a few copies to your rich buddies, you can imagine the price of the most famous Son of Sam murder on a tape? At least 50 grand each, I speculated, but like you say, this is like some collector of art who has a masterpiece stolen. He can't tell anybody he's got it, but he gets off knowing he does and reveals and sneaking into his vault and look at it. A monster ego trip, Zuckerman agreed, and if you ever needed cash, sell a few copies to your millionaire pals. Yeah, we've got that jet set of the occult and star stuff he put in that letter now. But who the hell is this Dale Evans character? Got me, Mike replied, but Radin produces concerts and shows with big names in them, and he's definitely into all this far-out crap. I think that's enough to start with. Colonel Kink and his own hell heroes, I said. Suddenly all... Oh, crap. Suddenly, all this Mondo Bizarre stuff makes sense. Radin in the same age bracket as Berkowitz and the Carboys. The damn thing is actually logical. Crazy logic, but still logic. The scenario made even more sense when I learned that the murdered Ronald Sisman, whom Vinny kept calling Sissick, was a close associate of Radin. Sisman was allegedly slain over the Moskowitz tape. In fact, Radin was interviewed by detectives after the October 30th, 1981 murders of Sisman and Smith College co-ed Elizabeth Plotzman, and Sisman, to complete the loop, had been dubbed the personal lensman for Maloney Haller, who, in April 1980, was the star of a video scandal at Radin's Atlantic beachfront estate in exclusive Southampton, Long Island, a 72-room palace on Dune Road called Ocean Castle. Radin's lavish home was shown locally as a haven for sex and dope parties, some involving the rich and famous. A month before the 1980 S&M blast, Haller posed for Playboy magazine, trying to capitalize on her small sweat hog role in Mr. Nodder's television classroom, and a month after the Southampton soiree, she accused Sisman of attempting to force drugs into her. Sisman told police he merely tried to offer her a tranquilizer, and the charges were dropped. 17 months later, it was Sisman who was dropped. This was a crowd in which murder, drugs, and depravity were commonplace. It was like seeing a reflection of a Sam cult. Vinny's statements, rather than straining credibility, could more appropriately be answered by, of course, I also learned that police raiding Ocean Castle on that wild Holler weekend confiscated a sex video starring none other than Raiden himself. The sex tape immediately brought to mind James Camaro's alleged performance in a similar epic with the woman producer from the TV network. And at more than 6 feet tall and 280 pounds, the bearded Raiden also matched the description Vinny provided of Roden, right down to the glasses he usually wore. Once more, the informants were leading us down a corridor of confirmations and complementary details. Other articles seized in the Holler raid included a quantity of drugs, a .38 handgun, and a set of privately posed photos of nude young women wearing a Nazi cap, an adornment I noted with interest. He had a whole harem out there, said attorney Stephen Siegfried, who defended Raiden in the Holler case. The lawyer's comment made to the New York Times long after Vinny's statement blended with what the informants said about the cult and collegiate call-girl network. Actually, Holler, railroading so to speak, was the second time the police attention was directed to Ocean Castle. That 1980 weekend, they first investigated a report that Raiden's assistant, Michael Deems DeVinco, known as Mickey DeVinco, to the inner circle, had overdosed on drugs before linking up with Raiden in various enterprises. Mickey DeVinco had been the husband of the famed singer-actress Judy Garland at the time of her death in 1969 and night manager of the upscale Arthur Disco in Manhattan. In the Holler case, Raiden was charged with criminal prosecution of LSD and cocaine, unlawful possession of a handgun, and menacing the 23-year-old starlet. Raiden's girlfriend and later second wife, Toni Fillet, was accused of third-degree assault. The assault charges against both were later dismissed, but Raiden was fined $1,000 and placed on probation for the unlicensed .38 revolver. Additionally, Robert McKeague IV, a 45-year-old New Jersey businessman who was Holler's date that weekend, pleaded guilty to assault and was sentenced to 30 days in jail. A similar tidal wave washed through Ocean Castle in 1981. On the night of Raiden's wedding there to Fillet, after the reception, aspiring model J.C. Layton was lying nude in a sauna at 2 a.m. when Raiden, she said, entered and demanded sex from her. Layton, who would become the girlfriend of appliance heir Christopher Maytag, who died of cocaine abuse in 1987, told police that Raiden assaulted her when she refused to comply. Authorities couldn't corroborate Layton's story, which Raiden denied, but they again removed pills and drug paraphernalia from the estate. Drugs were everywhere in the Raiden portrait, and he was a known heavy user of cocaine, sometimes spending more than $1,000 a week on the trendy white powder. Raiden was also closely allied with Sisman, whom he and the police knew was dealing coke. According to Vinny, Raiden had a piece of that action and influenced Sisman's operation, but I wasn't completely satisfied as to the extent of Raiden's alleged dealings until I learned that he was a top target of a secret federal probe of coke trafficking among New York's social and show business elite. It was believed organized crime involvement lurked somewhere in the network, perhaps in the form of a fringe relationship. "Bingo," I said to Hank Sinodi as we met one afternoon in a Bronx dinner. "The feds couldn't get enough to indict him, but with what our guys know, maybe they could have. We already knew about this amigo Sisman's dealing, and now we've got Raiden himself in there too. His relationship with Sisman would be enough, Hank replied. That just adds to it. The whole sex and dope scene is falling in just the way you boys upstate said it did. Yes, it was. But despite his troubles with the Southampton authorities, Raiden was still big trouble for us. We had many police connections, a fact which may have answered a number of questions which were swimming in my mind for years. I couldn't prove it, but I'd always suspected a leak. Besides, our own activities may have been a contributory factor in the curiously timed deaths of the Carr brothers. I also wondered if the door was slammed on the Son of Sam case for reasons beyond politics, career enhancement, and face saving. Raiden. Oh, crap. Raiden had the money, friends, and other connections to buy someone if he needed to. It was possible that several elements combined were at play. It wouldn't have been the first time, but a suspicion wasn't proof. Roy Alexander Raiden was about 32 years old in 1982 when Mike Zuckerman and I learned he was an alleged overlord of the operation we were investigating. Despite his youth, Raiden had accumulated a fortune. Ocean Castle alone was worth an estimated $3 million. Raiden was a theatrical and concert producer, and much of his wealth was earned via the production and staging of large benefit shows for police unions and associations throughout the country. As such, his official links were numbered and widespread. Raiden's shows were star-studded events with vaudeville and other luminaries, some fading headlining his bills. Milton Berle, Red Buttons, Donald O'Connor, Jane Murray, Tinny Tim, Eddie Fisher, George Jessel, and others were professionally associated with Raiden, who also assumed a role in the management of actor Demon Wilson's career. Wilson had co-starred as Red Fox's son on the hit TV series Stanford and Son and in the short-lived New Odd Couple and Baby I'm Back. But for all his acumen, the SS Raiden ran aground temporarily in 1975 when New York's Attorney General filed a civil suit charging that Raiden routinely pocketed 75% or more of police benefit proceeds. Raiden denied the accusation, and the matter was resolved when he agreed to stop organizing police fundraisers in New York State. It may have been then that he decided to show up to the establishment. In any case, Raiden reportedly sidestepped the local restriction by arguing that police agencies were labor unions and not charities. Therefore, no one could claim he was bilking police widows and children, and so the beat went on. Show business blood flowed through Raiden's veins since birth. His mother, Renee, was an ex-showgirl, and his father, Broadway Al Raiden, owned speakeasies and nightclubs during New York City's golden age. Al Raiden's connections cut across the New York scene when his parents divorced. Roy Raiden lived with his father in Florida for a time. He later dropped out of high school to create a traveling show which starred the venerable J. Fred Muggs, the chimpanzee who cavorted with Dave Garroway during the early days of NBC's Today Show. From the Darwinian genesis, Raiden evolved into rock music production, theatrical management, and the nomadic vaudeville extravaganzas which made him a millionaire at the age of 25. But success went to Raiden's head badly. His words spun erratically through a galaxy of parties, drugs, overindulgence, big spending, and observed cruelty to women. On one sadistic weekend at Ocean Castle, Raiden's guests were invited to pack dog collars and leashes on their overnight bags, and not because he was hosting the Suffolk County Kennel Club either. A local merchant on Hampton Road was puzzled by the number of people who stopped by to stock up for canine papers. The bicoastal Raiden maintained offices in New York and on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, city of fallen angels. Back and forth he shuttled his jet set life of amalgam of champagne, coke, women, limos, and lechery. As the power trip and drugs took him over, Raiden sank ever deeper into depravity. He became a glassy-eyed caricature of the 1930s Hollywood mogul strutting through Southampton, bodyguards in tow, flaunting a devilish black cape and twirling a cane. Walter has been known to seek its own level. Raiden counted among his many friends one Paul Hill, a wealthy Manhattan heir whose townhouse was nicknamed the Nursery because he was passionately attracted to pubescent girls, a trait he shared with a certain law enforcement official and with John Carr and the Sam Cult, to whom the rape of a young girl was a sacred satanic symbol. Hill had a special technique. He'd hook the kids on dope to ensure their dependency on him. There may be some justice, for it appears that Hill himself became a junkie by 1985, bitten by his own snake. Bill wasn't the only Raiden associate to ferment in a vile vat. Raiden's guests at parties became wilder and seedier. Videotapes rained. On one occasion, a local delivery boy told of seeing biker types barring knives and guns prowling the halls of Ocean Castle, standing tall at center stage. The youth reported was Raiden. The story meshed with what Vinny said much earlier about elements of the cult crowd dropping by the mansion now and then. As Raiden and his companion regressed, the power-obsessed Raiden began questing for the ultimate thrill, and the informants maintained he found it in the ultimate evil. By the end of 1982, Raiden's marriage to Tony Follett was done, ripped R.I.P.D. after barely more than a year. Did he mean died? Rest in peace after a year? I don't know. Ocean Castle was up for sale, and Raiden was pondering a move into Manhattan or out of L.A. We now had an alleged leader in sight, and the information I'd compiled did nothing but strengthen the informant's statements, but it wasn't enough without corroborating evidence to arrest him. There was nothing anybody could do but wait and watch. And in light of the history of the case, we were sure the volcano would erupt again sooner or later. The outside world wasn't on hold while the Raiden investigation progressed. On May 8, 1982, tragedy struck once more. On the 4th anniversary of David Berkowitz's guilty pleas, his chief counsel at the time, Leon Stern, was shot to death when he and his wife apparently surprised two burglars who broke into their Roslyn Harbor, Long Island home. Returning from an evening out, Stern, 56, and his wife Laura Raiden had the money, friends, and other connections to buy someone if he needed to. It was possible that several elements combined were at play. It wouldn't have been the first time, but a suspicion wasn't proof. Roy Alexander Radin was but 32 years old in 1982 when Mike Zuckerman and I first learned he was an alleged overlord of the operation we were investigating. Despite his youth, Radin had accumulated a fortune. Ocean Castle alone was worth an estimated $3 million. Radin was a theatrical and concert producer, and much of his wealth was earned via the production and staging of large benefit shows for police unions and associations throughout the country. As such, his official links were numbered and widespread. Radin's shows were star-studded events with vaudeville and other luminaries, some fading, headlining his bills: Milton Berle, Red Buttons, Donald O'Connor, Jane Maury, Tiny Tim, Eddie Fisher, George Jessel, and others were professionally associated with Radin, who assumed a role in the management of actor Desmond Wilson's career. Wilson had co-starred as Red Fox's son on the hit TV series Stanford and Son, and in the short-lived New Odd Couple and Baby I'm Back. But for all his acumen, the SS Radin ran aground temporarily in 1975 when New York's Attorney General filed a civil suit charging that Radin routinely pocketed 75% or more of police benefit proceeds. Radin denied the accusation, and the matter was resolved when he agreed to stop organizing police fundraisers in New York State. It may have been then that he decided to show up the establishment. In any case, reportedly sidestepped the local restriction by arguing that police agencies were labor unions and not charities. Therefore, no one could claim he was bilking police widows and children, and so the beat went on. Show business blood flowed through Radin's veins. I feel like I've read this. Oh, excuse me. Something feels wrong here. Show business flowed through Radin's veins since birth. His mother, Renee, was an ex-showgirl, and his father, Broadway Al Radin, owned speakeasies and nightclubs during the New York City's golden age. I felt like I've read this. Al Radin's connections cut across the New York scene when his parents divorced. Roy Radin lived with his father in Florida for a time. He later dropped out of high school to create a traveling show which starred the venerable J. Fred Muggs, a chimpanzee on the Today Show. I know I've read this. What the fuck? From the Darwinian genesis, Radin evolved into rock music production, theatrical management, and nomadic vaudeville extravaganzas, was made a millionaire by age 25. But success went to Radin's head badly. His world spun erratically through a galaxy of parties, drug overindulgences, big spending, and often reserved cruelty to women. On one sadistic weekend at Ocean Castle, Radin's guests were invited to pack dog collars, leashes to their overnight bags, not because he was hosting a Suffolk County kennel club. Either a local merchant Hampton Road was puzzled by the number of people who stopped by to stock up for canine papers. I know I fucking read this. What the fuck? Bicoastal Radin maintained offices in New York on Sunset Boulevard, in Los Angeles City, the Fallen Angels. Forth he shuttered his jet-set life, an amalgam of champagne, coke, women, limos, lechery. I know I fucking read this. Jesus Christ. Back and forth, he shuttled his jet-set life, an amalgam of champagne, coke, women, limos, and lechery. As the power trip and drugs took him over, Raiden sank ever deeper into depravity. He became a glassy-eyed caricature of the 1930s Hollywood mogul, strutting through Southampton bodyguards in tow, flaunting a devilish black cape and twirling a cane. While water had been known to seek its own level, Raiden counted among his many friends one Paul Hill, a wealthy Manhattan heir whose townhouse was nicknamed the nursery because he was passionately attracted to pubescent girls, a trait shared with certain law enforcement officials with John Carr and the Sam cult, to whom the rape of several young a young girl was a sacred satanic symbol. Hill had a special technique. He'd hook the kids on dope to ensure their dependency on him. There may be some justice, for it appears that Hill himself became a junkie by 1985 by his own snake. Bill Hill wasn't the only Raiden associate to ferment in a vile vat. Raiden's guests and parties became wilder and seedier. Videotapes reigned. On one occasion, a local delivery boy told of seeing biker types bearing knives and guns prowling the halls of Ocean Castle, standing tall at center stage. The youth reported was Raiden. The story meshed with what Vinny said much earlier about the elements of the cult crowd dropping by the mansion now and then. As Raiden and his companions regressed, the power-obsessed Raiden began questing for the ultimate thrill, and the informants maintained he found in the ultimate evil. By the end of 1982, Raiden's marriage to Tony Fillet was done, ripped after barely more than a year. Ocean Castle was up for sale, and Raiden was pondering a move into Manhattan or out of L.A. We now had an alleged leader in sight, and the informant ID complied did nothing but strengthen the informant's statements. But it wasn't enough. Without corroborating evidence to arrest him, there was nothing anybody could do but wait and watch. And in the light of history of the case, we were sure the volcano would erupt again sooner or later. The outside world wasn't on hold while the Raiden investigation progressed. On May 8, 1982, tragedy struck once more. On the 4th anniversary of David Berkowitz's guilty pleas, his chief counsel at the time, Leon Stern, was shot to death, and when he and his wife apparently surprised two burglars who broke into their Roslyn Harbor, Long Island home returning from an evening out, Stern, 56, and his wife were jumped in their garage. Mrs. Stern was taken upstairs and bound, but Stern was killed when he struggled for the intruder's gun. Berkowitz had spoken to an attorney, Henry Lipsig, for months earlier, and now his own former lawyer was murdered because of the fact and the date of the shooting. Those probing the Son of Sam case kept a watchful eye on the Stern murder. Two Queens men were subsequently arrested by Nassau County Police, and from all appearances, Stern was indeed killed by burglars. Still, it marked the violent death of yet another person closely tied to the 44 case. At about this time, Lipsig and I became targets of an intended smear campaign by the Church of Scientology. The shifty cult was unnerved because one of its mid-level counselors, Michael Carr, was linked to the case, although no public disclosure of his involvement had been made. The group also feared that Lipsig and I intended to lay responsibility for the 44 murders at its doors. The church, of course, didn't know that Berkowitz termed the Sam cult a violent Scientology offshoot, or that he possessed the telephone number of their Florida headquarters, the Fort Harrison Hotel in Clearwater, or that I knew that the Borelli letters' allusion to victims as fair game was a lift from Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard's notorious fair game memo on the treatment of enemies. That phrase, I was sure, was courtesy of Michael Carr. But from the available evidence, Scientology itself wasn't involved in the 44 killings. An offspring wasn't a parent, and we viewed the phone number as evidence of Berkowitz's link to Michael Carr, who had been to Clearwater. It was true that the church was fertile ground from which a devious member could pluck recruits for the Satanic movement. It was true that the process sprang from Scientology when the de Grimsons set sail on their own. It was true that Charles Manson, before the Tate LaBianca murders, received Scientology counseling from a fellow inmate in a federal prison in the mid-60s, and it was true that Berkowitz's named accomplice, Michael Carr, was a Scientologist. But beyond those links, there was nothing with which to accuse the group of complicity. But that didn't stop Scientology from plotting against Lipsig and me. Only I found out about it. Harry and I weren't the first citizens to smear Harry and I weren't the first citizens of Smear City. The FBI had an extensive file on the group's activities and raided its Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. headquarters in July 1977. In the aftermath, 9 Scientologists pleaded guilty to 1 count of each of their conspiracy to burglarize or obstruct of justice. Mary Sue Hubbard, wife of L. Ron Hubbard, was among the guilty. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $10,000 for obstructing justice. In 1984, a New York Times report on the cult stated it was long a subject of government investigation. The article further said several former officials of the church who were disenchanted with L. Ron Hubbard had admitted helping him divert more than $100 million in church funds to foreign bank accounts. Scientology isn't a religion based on worship of any god. Rather, it holds that one can discover inner peace through self-awareness and a counseling program known as auditing. Budding Scientologists will sometimes pay up to $300 an hour for auditing, during which a counselor gauges their responses to life questions through a device called an e-meter. The process purports to enhance one's ability to soul search, and according to former officials, it also enhances the ability to control large foreign bank accounts. Author Paulette Cooper, whose book titled The Scandal of Scientology speaks for itself, was targeted for an intelligence operation, as was Boston attorney Michael Flynn, who sued the church at least 20 times on behalf of former members. He was our number one enemy. We were always trying to set up an operation against Michael, former Scientology official Lauren Sullivan told the Times. In 1980, the Miami Herald published a comprehensive report which found that Scientology orchestrated smear campaigns and employed other covert tactics to gain a strong foothold in Clearwater. A wing of the church had undertaken a systematic program of spying and burglary that went on for years, reporter John Dorshner wrote. Reporters for the St. Petersburg, Florida Times, the Clearwater Sun, and other publications also have investigated the group. Geoff Chervell, Dick Story, Debbie Ward. If exposure renders intelligence operatives useless, then those 3 Scientologists may wish to short-circuit their e-meter. Story in L.A. and Shrevel and Ward in New York were among the church members who plotted against Harry Lipsig and me. Scientology has its own spy network, all right, and it is known as the Guardians. Through a confidential source, certain Scientology documents fortuitously came into my possession in mid-1982, and they are now in the hands of law enforcement, where they remain accessible to me. One thick folder immediately caught my attention. It was labeled Lipsig Estimate, and it detailed the church's plot of the month. Geoff Chervell, whose immigration status was unknown, he apparently is British, ran the operation out of New York. where Ward and others assisted him. Story was the major honcho in LA. In short, the cult feared that a major effort was underway to hang the Son of Sam murders on it, and that Lipsig also was going to employ the 44 connection as a weapon in another case he was handling against the church. So they drew up a plan of action against Lipsig and me, designed to discredit us. They infiltrated Lipsig's large firm and removed legal documents, interviewed the Carr family, and planned to utilize various media contacts to blacken our reputations. Here are some of the excerpts from the report. Jesus Christ. Replacement of Terry. The idea is to have our friend replace Terry and OL main contact for Lipsig. Terry and Lipsig may be so closely involved together that it would be dangerous to try and split them up. We may have to handle them as a team rather than two individuals. Notwithstanding, we should at least see, if possible, for our person operative to become indispensable to Lipsig in a greater degree than Maury Terry. This will be achieved by our person having more to offer Lipsig in the way of contacts in the religious field, which is what Lipsig is going to need. To punish this anti-cult attack, expose on Terry. At some point we are going to have to do an expose on Terry and his false reports and do a full investigation of his investigation into the whole Berkowitz affair. He is the mouthpiece for Berkowitz and he has to be discredited. This would preferably be done off of their lines. The reason for this is obvious. If we do it, then we have such a vested interest that it will simply be our word against Maury Terry's. So some credible source will have to be found. This is something which should be researched immediately. Expose on Lipsig. This activity will also be conditional on his relationship with Terry. If they are really tight, then we will have to expose them both together. The value of this expose on Lipsig will be enhanced by any connection we can prove to any government agency, and of course any psych agency. In another section, the following was written. Lipsig wants to connect SCN to the Son of Sam case. He has deposed Berkowitz, who supposedly told him that there existed this death cult. Lipsig's connection is, of course, the fact that Michael Carr was a Scientologist, and he is going to try to blow that out of proportion. It was heard that Lipsig told of his secretary to note. It was heard that Lipsig told his secretary to note down that he wants to get support data that confirms the identifying of the bodies of John and Michael Carr. Lipsig says there are people who do not want this civil suit against Berkowitz to go to trial. The police commissioner is one. If it was heard today that Berkowitz was raised a Jew, but was a born-again Christian. When giving the above data, the secretary of Lipsig's office said it came from a Mr. Turr. She stopped in the middle of the guy's name. When asked if she meant Mr. Terry, she gave no answer. The report also contains some 20 marked Son of Sam stories and an assessment. There are press lines which can be utilized to counter the black PR campaign, my articles and Lipsig's public comments. So the Scientologists had friends in the media, probably secret members, nice thought to contemplate. I immediately alerted Lipsig, who took steps on his end, and were put on guard for the future. It would be too easy and a mistake to dismiss the Scientologists as merely paranoid. They are of much more concern than that, as anyone who has crossed swords with them can attest. I and many others endorse official efforts to root out any illegal activities conducted by this so-called church. I regard the group as an abhorrent stain on the American landscape, a mind-bending cult of which parents and educators should be aware, and to which young people should give the widest berth possible. As 1983 Bowden, the Son of Sam investigation was still focused in New York. In Minot, Jeff Neese and Mike Knoop remained alert, but activity there all but ceased because the prime players had left Ward County. Lieutenant Terry Gardner was gone from the sheriff's department to New York and corporate security. From Santa Clara, Sergeant Ken Kahn called periodically to learn what he could about Manson 2's identity. My correspondence with Vinny and Danny continued, and John Santucci's office in Queens remained frustrated by the refusal of Berkowitz or another participant to turn state's evidence. In January, producer Frank Anthony, who coordinated the several What's Happening America programs in 1981, asked if I'd do an update on a special documentary, The War Within, which would be hosted by prominent attorney F. Lee Bailey. The Syndicate hour-long show, which would air in June, would highlight the Son of Sam and Atlanta child murder cases. I readily agreed, and we started production. Roy Radin's role and the larger scope of the case would remain secret, but I consented to allude to a 1981 Manhattan murder without naming Sisman or releasing any particulars. That part of the report would be picked up by the wire services, along with Santucci's restated comments on the conspiracy's existence. In early February, after months of persuasion, Vinny consented to make a formal statement about Radin to authorities. In my presence, he recited the tales for 3 hours. 2 months later, Roy Radin told his half-sister Diane Dorr that he had to vacate the New York scene for a time. "I'm going away for a while. I have to go away," she quoted him saying. He was very strange about it. Shortly after, John Santucci and I met in his office to discuss the matter of Roy Radin, Lord of Southampton. "I have nothing to base a warrant on," the DA explained. "Vinny says the tape allegedly was made for Radin, but I can't tell a judge we have evidence. It's in that damned mansion of his. We don't know where it's supposed to be, and no one says Radin was a direct participant. He wasn't at any crime scenes, or even at any of these meetings in Westchester and whatever else." How many more pages do I got? My God. 2 pages. Oh my God. "And no one says Radin was a direct participant. He wasn't at any crime scenes, or even at any of these meetings in Westchester and wherever else." "That's true," I reluctantly agreed. "He's insulated himself pretty well. This James Camaro was at crime scenes, but we can't find him. Everyone else he's talked about is real, so I'm sure Camaro is too. I'd obviously help if we had the exact name, but we don't." What about this real estate lawyer?" Santucci asked. "Several possibilities, but no one we can say for sure. That church up there existed, but the witch who was in it is long gone. I've got nothing but problems with this case," Santucci complained. "I'd give anything to be able to convene a grand jury, but my hands are tied. I know you don't like that, and you don't want to accept it, but it's true. I still need independent corroboration or first-hand testimony from Berkowitz or someone else. Vinny and Danny said they'd testify. I tried. Not good enough. Whatever they say may be golden, but it would still net out as hearsay in a courtroom. So what in the hell do we do about Raiden? We wait. I can't do anything about him right now at this moment. He's untouchable. No, he wasn't. Roy Raiden disappeared on Friday, the 13th of May, in Los Angeles, said to be the home of the Sam cult's national headquarters. It took weeks for the news to trickle out, but when it did, chaos ruled the lives of those immersed in the investigation. For days, my phone rang off the hook as contacts and sources called to find out if I knew anything. From Dannemora, Vinny wrote, "Tell me, when a person dies, to whom he bequeath his videotape collection. Remember the meeting? They asked if I thought they could just go put handcuffs on a millionaire. I'll even be I'll bet even he wishes they did so now." Vinny had produced Raiden dead, but officially he'd vanished into thin air. My own initial fear was a four-letter word spelled Leak. John Carr, Michael Carr, and now Raiden. They had one thing in common. Their names were handed to authorities shortly before they died or disappeared. Queens had nothing to do with the prior information on the cars, and Brooklyn didn't know about Raiden, so a leak wouldn't have sprung from the prosecution, but prosecutors' offices routinely deal with the police, so if there had been a leak, I reasoned some police agency would have been the source. Slowly, sketchy details of a disappearance became known. Raiden had been on the coast working on a movie deal with producer Bob Evans, friend of Roman Polanski et al. On the night of the 13th, Raiden entered a limousine outside Hollywood's Regency Hotel with a woman named Elaine Jacobs, whom East Coast papers dubbed a mysterious woman. An uneasy Raiden had asked actor Demon Wilson, armed with a handgun, to trail them. Wilson followed the limo for a time, but said that another car moved between them on Sunset Boulevard, and that he lost both vehicles in traffic. Raiden and Jacobs were supposed to have dinner at La Scala restaurant, but never made it in. Or at least Raiden didn't. Jacobs told two stories about what happened. First, she claimed she and Raiden argued and left the limo on Sunset. Next, she said it was she who got out of the car after the heated discussion. He hadn't been seen since. Raiden's 1983 dealings with both Jacobs and Evans were sparked by a film Evans wanted to procure, The Cotton Club. Short of cash, Evans, whom Jacobs allegedly introduced to Raiden, agreed to enter into a partnership with the Southampton squire, who said he could raise $35 million to finance the Cotton Club and two subsequent projects. Through a spokesman, Evans told the New York Post that there wasn't any deal with Raiden. That wasn't true. On April 26th, 17 days before Raiden disappeared, he and Evans signed a contract which allocated to each a 45% share of the Cotton Club and the subsidiary projects. The remaining 10% was assigned to Puerto Rican banker Jose Alegria, whose government was to provide Raiden's contribution. In other words, since linking the contract, Evans no longer had controlling interest in his own project. I couldn't believe Evans signed it. Alegria later told New York Magazine, "I told Roy, the day will come when this guy realizes he's not in control." For her part, the dark-haired 37-year-old Jacobs, also known as Elaine Delany, and Karen Goodman, formerly was romantically linked with reputed Miami cocaine king Milan Bellachase. Jacobs was promised a $50,000 finder's fee from Raiden on the Cotton Club deal, but she suspected that Raiden was somehow involved in the alleged theft of 11 to 16 kilos of cocaine from her rented home in Sherman Oaks, California. In an LA suburb, Jacobs allegedly believed that Radin had conspired with her dope runner, Talmadge Tally Rogers, who hadn't been seen since the purported ripoff occurred in March. So there it stood. Evans, Jacobs, drug deals, Hollywood films, and a missing Roy Radin. At 11 a.m. on June 10th, beekeeper Glenn Fisher entered a desolate, dusty canyon some 60 miles north of L.A. On this warm morning, Fisher was searching for a suitable location to set up his hives. Down a rutted dirt path, he walked into the yawning hole known as Caswell Canyon. To his right, a dried creek bed, blanched in blistering June sun. Sagebrush, tumbleweed, and desert foliage splashed patches of color on the grainy, hilly landscape, and clumps of hardy trees flaunted their green resilience to the sizzling sky. At his feet, Fisher noted fragments of shattered clay targets someone had used in the area for a skeet practice. Whoever it was, the beekeeper thought didn't belong to any Hollywood rod and gun club. Nobody but a desert rat would know about this forsaken place. Behind him, to the west, Fisher faintly heard the infrequent whiz of a passing car on Highway 5. To reach the canyon, one drove an hour north from L.A., and exited Route 5 at Hungry Valley Road. Turning east, a driver would then swing north again to traverse the dead-end Copco Canyon Service Road, which paralleled the highway before abruptly ending at a metal barrier. Beyond the rail, hidden behind a small thicket of underbrush, lay the narrow dirt road on which the beekeeper now walked. The path could be negotiated by car, but only by someone who knew it existed in the first place. Several hundred yards into the canyon, a hot breeze filled Fisher's nostrils with an unfamiliar, pungent aroma somewhat akin to a flavored pipe tobacco. Across the creek bed, Fisher noticed a large green shrub which looked almost like a wide fir tree. It was thick, its full branches hugged the ground, and tall grass further hid its base from view. The beekeeper thought he saw something on the earth beside the shrub. Crossing the dry creek, Fisher hopped up the south bank and walked 8 feet to the dense branches. Looking down, he saw it. It was dressed in a dark blue suit, a vest, dress shirt, and tie. 4 buttons were torn from the vest and 2 from the shirt, which was laid open. The suit's front pockets were turned out. Someone had removed the identification from whatever this had been. It was lying on its back. A Gucci loafer remained on the right foot. The other shoe was next to the body. The left hand was raised upward, grotesquely grabbing a lower branch of the shrub. The body was mummified, and there was a large hole in where the front of the skull should have been. Beetles swarmed in the hollow stomach cavity. It was the horrified Fisher saw, the shriveled baking corpse of what was once a large, well-dressed man. Now its weight was a mere 69 pounds, and it languished in the moisture of its own fluids, which still seeped into the earth beneath it. Fisher now knew what the bittersweet odor was. It was Roy Radin. "We're going to the coast," I excitedly told Georgiana. "We've got our week at Fire Island, and we'll go right from the beach to the airport. Ted Gunderson is expecting us in L.A., and he's arranging a meeting with the sheriff homicide people." "I'm already packing 2 wardrobes," she said, laughing. "I knew there was no way you'd stay home on this one. Vinny knew it too," he wrote. "When you go to the coast, look out for souvenirs, understand? You know what to look for, even if everyone else doesn't. Look for those signs we've discussed in the past, ritual objects at crime scenes, and if you get to view anything about the dead flying monster, see if you can identify the marks, etc. Comprende?" The question I pose to you is this. They know the victim, but do they realize what people were hunting for? It involves movies, videotapes. That I verified for sure in October 1981. They acted to preserve those tapes. I'm not sure yet if this was purely over that. There could be other motives too, but from every source I have, it's about the thing we're interested in, and definitely involved the same cast of actors. It's just a hunch, but I say Manson 2 or Frank, if that's his name. I believe this was his pet assignment. Do you honestly think the flying monster traveled all the way to the Sunshine State and didn't visit any of his old acquaintances? Well, if he didn't plan to, they certainly did plan on visiting him. Bleed the coast for all you can. I'm glad the East is staying out because you can probably get info from the West that they don't even realize is valuable. It is subtle things we need. They will break this thing eventually. Maury will then learn that I've only told the truth. Yes, it sounds fantastic, but so many true things sound fantastic. Let's see, what number of victim is this now? One by one, everyone is disappearing. You know, in another 2 years, there won't be anyone left to capture, except for Manson 2. Do you realize that LA is now the hottest place in this investigation? I'd say the hottest people left are Manson 2, Camaro, and Mr. Real Estate. Camaro seems to be nowhere, and Mr. Real Estate is there, but nobody seems to be able to put their finger on him yet. Ironically, people are dropping like flies around me. I'm not Houdini. I can't predict deaths in advance by magic. We've both paid a high price in years to effort. A high price in years of effort and frustration. I'm sick and tired of handing gems to assholes and watching them bury it in bureaucratic inanities. You will note I am as humble and soft-spoken as ever. When you go, listen very closely and look for ties. This one was kept tight. Seems to have been a surprise to all as it came down, except for one interesting bit of info. Seems a certain person, Raiden, was advised very heavily against a vacation to that place. So was it about the things we're interested in? Vinny wrote, drugs, big money, and somewhere in the picture a videotape or movie. Perhaps, as he suggested, several motives converged at once. The week at Fire Island was a good one. The old friends were there, including George Austin, who'd moved across the walk to share a home with Martin and Pat Burke. Coincidentally, Marty Burke was a close friend of Joe Walsh, a writer I knew well from Westchester. Walsh had summoned in the Hamptons for years and heard the stories about Raiden and Ocean Castle. He was something of a local legend for his weirdness out there, he said. All sorts of bizarre nonsense was supposed to be going on. Some Hamptons people knew about it, and now he got his. And we were going to try to find out why. Just as importantly, we were going to see if the still unidentified Manson 2 might have participated in the killing. I had a description of Manson 2, and I also knew he would somehow trace back to the original Charles Manson. He would appear somewhere in the Manson family, or in the show business or drug circles Manson himself inhabited. And perhaps we'd find out for whom Manson volunteered to commit the Tate murders and why. It was an almost impossible mission, but we had to try. In that, I was fortunate to have the assistance of Ted Gunderson. The gray-haired 52-year-old Gunderson was a retired FBI senior special agent in charge. Before leaving the Bureau, he'd headed offices in Dallas, Philadelphia, and elsewhere before assuming command of some 800 agents in Southern California. After retiring in 1979, he opened a successful private investigation agency in L.A. Through producer Frank Anthony Gunderson and I had earlier made contact by telephone, and now Roy Radin was murdered on Ted's home turf. In that respect, I was lucky. The highly qualified Gunderson was willing to assist in the investigation for no fee. He knew what was at stake. Aboard a Pan Am flight on Sunday afternoon, July 17th, I busied myself with notes on the case while Georgiana watched a film. Our plan was to spend 3 days in LA before driving up the coast to Monterey, then to Stanford University in Palo Alto on the Arliss Perry case, and on into San Francisco for a long weekend of relaxation. I had a feeling we'd need it. We touched down at LA International about 7 p.m. with a waiting rental car. We were but a short drive from the Marina International Hotel in Marina del Rey, a few blocks from Venice Beach and the rolling Pacific. Stepping from the terminal into the gathering dust, I was struck by the thought of that man whose murder we were probing had walked through those same doors for the last time 2 months before. "Welcome to LA," I said to Georgiana. "We're right back where all this lunacy really began in the late 60s, and now it's gone across the damn country and come home again. And so have we," she answered, sliding our luggage into the back of the car. We pulled into light traffic on Lincoln Boulevard as we drove north toward the marina. "I can't help thinking about Manson, too. The deadliest of all of them," I said, pointing toward the hazy LA skyline to the east. "He's right about us now, either somewhere over there in the city or in one of these suburbs along the coast. Venice, the marina, Santa Monica, Torrance, Manhattan Beach, somewhere here. Damn, the whole freaking headquarters or whatever it is here." "What do you suppose that is?" Georgiana asked, as the Beach Boys' "I Get Around" piped from the car stereo, making me wish it was the summer of '64 again. Do you think it's an old church or private clubhouse?" "Yeah, one of the three." None of the informants knew which. It was twilight, and the colors and sounds of Marina del Rey beckoned us. "It's beautiful here," I said. "Thousands of boats, great restaurants, and right off the ocean. The hotel is also done with a nautical flair." "Some of these places look familiar," Georgiana noticed. "They use this area a lot for TV backdrops, don't they?" "Yeah, they do. Hey, after we check in and eat, let's hit the beach and walk a little. In the Atlantic this morning and the Pacific tonight. Bi-coastal beach bums. Tomorrow's time enough to worry about Radin. Ted's coming for breakfast at 9, and we've got the cops at 11. And we're going out to the scene, right?" "Absolutely. That area's got to be searched. I'm sure the cops will give us directions." "You're into the upper levels of this now," Georgiana remarked. "The TV show worked fine, and you were still able to keep this part out." "We had to. There'd be no way of getting anywhere at all on this otherwise. Nobody knows a damn thing, so we're going to be able to sneak in the back door here." I refrained from bringing up the fear factor. Secrecy about Radin and Manson, too, also helped us sleep better, and was especially important now that we'd landed in Manson 2's backyard. We had no reason to be worried about us, and that's the way I wanted to keep it. He had no reason to be worried about us, and that's the way I wanted to keep it. Particularly since the previous month's TV reports also aired in LA, I was certain he and his friends had seen it. Later, after a quiet dinner of prawns and shrimp, Luis at a seaside restaurant in Venice, we wandered the darkened beach beside us. The Pacific waves crested majestically and slapped the shore. "I've got to thank Berkowitz for this someday," I said. "It's a perfect night in a perfect spot. Finally, they've done a crime that didn't take me out to Monot or another one of those god-forsaken max prisons in the wilds of New York State, maybe I'll ask him if they have another branch in Tahiti. You like to joke your way through these things, Georgiana chided, but you're just trying to play Mr. Cool. This is probably the most important trip of the whole case. Which case? You know how many killings we've had to look into. But yeah, this trip may be for the whole enchilada. I stopped walking and gestured toward the invisible inland hills. Just think, we've now got a really Hollywood drama and shot on location too. Very funny, Georgiana laughed weakly. It's after 2 a.m. in New York, I think. Your jets are lagging. Screw it. I really do know how important these next few days are. It's been a long haul, so many people have come and gone. The case kept moving, and we kept moving with it. We've got Gary Buckhout left, and Hank Sinodi, and Joe Basteri, and Mike Novotny when he can do it, and Santucci, Georgiana added. Ah, yes. Those people are prosecutors, and they think like prosecutors. They're worried about the courtroom, which is their job. The rest of us think in terms of the investigation itself, the hunt. Queens is still waiting on somebody to turn. I'm not of a mind to count on that, and I've got no jurisdictional boundaries to be concerned with either. Maybe we can make something happen on our way. And so here we are in California, lady. In California, lady. Queens knows we're here, don't they? Yeah, they knew we were coming out for 2 days after we did. Yeah, they knew we were coming out 2 days after we did. I told Tom McCarthy. They just said good luck and want to be filled in when we get back. For a while, McCarthy had thoughts of coming with us. Well, let's hope something happens out of this week, Georgiana said. Ted'll be here early. Let's call it a night. I think we're both exhausted. We hiked back to the car, which was parked at the end of the nearly deserted Washington Street. Dishes clinked through the open window of restaurant kitchens as cleanup crews drew the curtain on another night. 2 Chicanos and Harleys lingered in front of a convenience store, and gulls picked at discarded French fries in the gutter. It was almost tomorrow. The coming days would make a difference, but no one could have anticipated that a stark, unnerving confirmation of what force was behind Roy Radin's murder would be discovered in less than 72 hours. The ultimate evil had risen from the depths of the river Styx and struck once again. My God. I don't know how I got mixed up on those pages, but Jesus Christ. Until next time.